Hi, kia ora koutou. Hi, everybody from New Zealand. And welcome, Francesca. Thank you for joining us in today's edition of From the Edge.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm going to go straight into it. It's great to have you here, Francesca, and it's great to make this connection between New Zealand and the States, between our little corner of New Zealand and Brooklyn in New York City. But you're not from Brooklyn originally. You grew up in Venezuela, and then some of the question in some of the chat we had before, you talked about the house you grew up in and how that influenced your design. I'm sure that all of us can say that in some way our formative years are very important in our design consciousness. How was that for you, and how did that influence your work?
Yes, well, I was born in Caracas, Venezuela, an American mother, Italian father, born in Venezuela, and so a mixed household that we had this sort of the image that's coming up right now is a view of the city with the backdrop to Caracas, which is in a valley, is the Avila, is this mountain range which orients every Caracas-born citizen. It's very much something that if you speak to anybody and say, what is a key element of what you remember from being at home, since so many Venezuelans live in the exterior, it's this mountain range. It orients you. It's the first way that I understood what north was. It has beautiful change of color over the seasons. There's like a purple heather flower that grows at a certain season. And so you get this gorgeous modeling of the ridges over the year. And that coupled with a sort of international modernist architectural style that became very popular in Venezuela, I didn't know about lighting then, but it did have a really sort of deep impact in the way that I then appreciated spaces. There's the UCB, which is the Central University of Venezuela, was designed by Carlos Raúl Villanueva, and if there's an image that I took on one of the last times I got to visit home, which shows the sort of perforated brick that is used as part of, basically to say this, a lot of the spaces are very open to the exterior. And I think it's that connection between the interior and the exterior being fairly permeable that I really took with me and wanted to continue to have that. You see a play in this image of direct light coming through. It gives you a temporal understanding of the space. It is playful in and of itself in the play of shadows. And I didn't know what it was that I loved about this, other than I thought it was energized, and a breeze would come through, or if it was a rainy season, the rain would pour down, but you could just be right inside and watch it out there. So something about that direct access to nature has been part of sort of my work today, and in understanding, always having a reference for this, and then understanding that not everybody else's reference was this. And that's the key thing, I think.
I think those images are remarkable in the way in which the light transforms the spaces. I mean, if you look at them without that light pattern, they would be pretty drab. They would be quite depressing. And yet what that light does is to totally enliven that whole space and gives it a vibrant feeling. And I think that's the core of what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yes, that's exactly that.
Yeah.
It's,
light. So which sort of leads on to the next question, which is this term lighting design. When we started talking about that, I was thinking in my head, okay, lighting design. I mean, I design lights, that's lighting design. That's an object, but is it designing the light in the space to create the certain ambience that you need? Is it architectural design of lighting a building, or is it projection onto a building? What exactly for you does lighting design mean?
It means anywhere that there is permanent lighting, interior, exterior, anywhere that you can sort of integrate lighting within a constructed space. And when I'm talking about the exterior, it's not always a constructed space, but it's more about the relationship of the landscape to daylight. Being a person who is specialized in light to be able to work with others to both communicate how light might act and to clarify how others want light to shape a space. I have a theatrical background as well, sort of theatrical lighting, and wanting, that's also sort of very quick and it changes and you can move around. But working as an architectural lighting designer, I get to work with clients who are going to live in their spaces for, the next 20 plus years, or somebody who's going to go to school and be in a room for 8+ hours a day. And so really wanting to understand how light is going to form and shape their perception of that space.
Yeah. And so is the process a scientific one, or is it an artistic one, or is it both? Or if it is, how do you meld those two quite often contradictory aspects?
It is always a combination of art and science. There is a few elements that come into it. I was not great at physics in high school, but I do understand sort of there's the physics of light, there's the physiology of our visual system, our visual sort of perception, our own, the psychology of sort of perception and how we understand spaces based on light. And then there's a very individual sort of appreciation for what you think is cozy or intimate or bright, what I think it is. And so that's the sort of human connection side, making sure that we're pairing that with what's the best light quality, and always a combination. And I think I sort of see myself as the mediator between those.
I mean, I'm more this. I'm the kind of the artistic side of it, and that brings up a question that you raised when we talked earlier about lighting up how a space feels. I mean, absolutely, what I'm trying to do is about what a space feels like and how we can transform a space with these kind of objects. So how do you light a space to feel better, to feel good? What are the sort of some of the tricks that you have for that?
I think the primary thing is to understand what you think, when you say what feels good, what are the things that you think are comfortable or uncomfortable. I pretty much ruin every experience when I go out with friends, because it's like, well, look at that, and what's going on there? Why did they do that? What's going on? Right. I think it's that, the curse of really being keyed into the observation of what's going on around us. My feline friend showing up. But often I start with, well, what do you not like? What isn't working for you? Because people may key into what they don't like more often than what they do like. There's a sense of, well, lighting is just about applying, turning something on and it fills a space. My process tends to be, well, let's figure out what you want it to feel like by identifying, is it closed, open, these sort of, is it compressed, is it the same words that I used before, is it intimate, is it cozy, is it warm, is it cool? Making sure that we're on the same page about those terms, and then integrating the light as much as possible, primarily by creating multiple layers of light. If I have a layer of light that sort of fills a space, then I can work with you, David, and say, you have this beautiful piece that is gorgeous to look at, and then also going to create a play of shadows, and it adds to these different layers and allows us to change how the space is used depending on the controls and the, the preference of the user. I think it's not an all or nothing. It's always sort of variable.
It's almost as if the best ones are the ones you're not aware of. It's like, there's nothing, I mean, maybe this is a bit too obvious, something that's sort of more subtle, that doesn't stand out, which creates an overall effect that you feel, but you don't actually visually kind of zoom in on and notice quite so strongly.
Yeah, I think to have both of those things happen, like if we keep a lot of the architectural lighting integrated and have it not be the sort of showy bits, then we have room for sort of more decorative pieces that really sing.
And you can, I mean, you set them up so you can control them. You can have more or less of either to create different sort of feelings at different times in those spaces.
Yeah.
So how do you convey this to the client? Because, I mean, an architect draws a building and she can draw spaces and even have fly-throughs and all the rest of it. But
yeah,
well, you're talking about something much more subtle. So how do you convey what you're trying to achieve to the client?
The primary way still relies a lot on some of the architectural conventions that we use, where we're integrating our lighting symbols into architectural drawings. So we haven't strayed so far from sort of architecture. That's still the basis, but we try to do a lot of sketches, not always photorealistic renderings. We don't necessarily like to jump right into that level, but showing somebody, again, what's the distribution of lighting? Is it going to just fill a space, or is it indirect lighting? And we do that in a very variety of ways: hand sketches, Photoshop overlays, a basic sort of model, 3D model that we then draw on top of. When we're sharing the design intent, we try to use a variety of tools to sort of communicate what we hope will be a common language, so that we can then move on to mocking things up, getting fixture samples to be able to test and show more realistically what a fixture might do.
But the problem is always that what you have in your mind is not necessarily what the client is seeing as well.
Yeah.
And this is a very clear form of communication, and I find this is often a barrier that we get stuck up against. You think that you're talking about the same thing, and actually you're not. And
Yeah.
we've got great tools for visualizing architecture, but it doesn't seem easy to do that for lighting.
No, and I think that's why at the beginning of every project, we spend a lot of time trying to get on the same page with clients. Just talking about language, providing samples, going to see someone's existing space, whether that's their existing office or home, so that we can say, based on your reference, what do you mean by this word?
Yeah.
And that's sort of our role as a lighting designer, to help get us to that common reference.
And that actually emphasizes the importance of that role. And there's a question which we received in advance of this conversation from Teresa Genovese, I hope I'm saying that right, from New York City. So how do you actually get lighting designers in on these projects? Because often architects don't even think about it. You know, the project goes ahead and then, oh, we need some lights, we'll put a couple here and the job's done. So how do we sort of push to have people like you working on these projects to get the results that we want?
We advocate for ourselves as much as possible. It's not the case that that the project always needs a lighting designer. And that's not the case that every project has the budget for additional consultants. But to share that we are going to be able to be there across all different phases of a project and say, here's how we can add value to your experience. Living in New York, the joys of probably the wrong doorbell. So how we can add value to the project, whether that is by supporting it in technical facets. Sometimes we get brought in because we help to show you that we're complying with the energy code or with a certification like WELL building standard or with LEED. Sometimes it's to help with permitting documents. And then in addition to that, we can say, while we're here, here's some of the things that you might want to consider, as opposed to simply applying light because you need to have it. What is your light doing for you?
Yeah, and as long as that message or value gets out, then people will start to employ you. And I think that, and if we can quantify that by saying that, you know, that the clients, the inhabitants, the occupants of the building are not turning over fast, that the employees are not turning over fast, or whatever, they're happy, or then there's a quantifiable benefit which would help promote that.
Yeah, and sort of as I mentioned before, hopefully you don't notice the lighting. And that's sort of like the approach that I took from theatrical lighting is, I don't want to be the star of the show. I want the space or other sort of elements to really shine or to really come through. And that happens if there is good lighting.
Yeah, and you notice it if it's bad.
Yep.
Changing the topic a little bit, we had the previous discussion we had was with Richard Taylor, talking about fractals and the effect of kind of patterns on our physiology and our psychology.
Yeah.
I understand you listened to that. What did you take away from that?
The thing I was most excited to hear was, I mean, it sounds like Richard's had a long struggle of trying to place himself between industries, but it's the appreciation for evidence-based design. You know, we don't design in a vacuum, and we don't design just because the thing that pops into my head must be the most amazing thing and it's the only way to resolve a problem. And often when we're sort of considering the fact that we're designing for other people, taking into consideration the opportunities where we can sort of test our theories, our hypotheses with a public. And I think I get to do this by supporting students during their thesis projects where they're doing evidence-based design and really promoting that model of sort of education, but also then trying to test that whenever we can, so that we're sort of getting outside of ourselves, not wanting to be stuck. And I think what I saw in the episode with Richard was him sort of constantly doing that and reevaluating some of sort of this understanding of the things that we feel attracted to naturally, whether they're sort of these natural patterns, the idea of the images from the university in Venezuela, naturally attracted to that sort of playful light. But then what does that do when we try to reintroduce it into a different space? Does it still work?
Yeah, and I think the message there that you're saying is really important, that we can't do that ourselves. We need the experts doing it and giving something a verification or value that we can then pass on to our clients. And
yeah.
The problem is we've always sort of tried to sort of do everything. We've made these claims ourselves, and they've become, without that sort of scientific backing, they sound nice, but you know, they can easily be dismissed. But I think if we've got that backing, it makes it much stronger. That's certainly what's happened with us.
Yeah. And I think I see that also in sort of like the evolution of design processes. You know, you have had such a beautiful career of sort of working and modifying. And from the perception of having seen you as from the designer perspective of how sort of products change and things that stay the same because there's this beautiful consistency of material, and then opportunities where there may be a new pattern or new shapes. And that's evidence of taking in feedback, of having things go out into the world and sort of processing that before it goes back out.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Can we talk about circadian, the word circadian rhythm, circadian daylight? It's a term that comes up a lot in the lighting industry. I don't really think I understand it well enough, and I'm sure other people are worse than me as well. Can you help us with that, exactly what it is and why it's important?
It's important because lighting is a key part of sort of our human physiology. And I preface that I am not sort of an expert. I practice as a lighting designer and try to employ some of these sort of circadian lighting into projects, but I'm not one of the people who's doing research on this. Generally, circadian lighting is the application of lighting that helps to promote or suppress our circadian rhythm. The fact that over the course of a day, we have both like melatonin and cortisol hormones that are produced in the body. And if we're just exposed to a typical, we were sitting outside all day, we were exposed to sort of the sun as it traveled through the sky, we would get the amount of sort of like the dosage of daylight that would help to suppress melatonin when it was needed. And then as the sun goes down, we'd be able to then move into our sleep cycle. We don't live that way. And we haven't for a long time, but we increasingly have exposure to screens. We stay up late into the night. We're a global community. We're talking to each other across multiple time zones. And so we are using lighting in a way that doesn't really support that natural cycle. So some of the circadian lighting sort of goals are really to, especially in environments where you're going to spend a lot of time, offices, schools, where you're there for prolonged periods, having lighting that helps to support that cycle. And so sometimes it's by having a higher threshold of a certain wavelength of light at a particular time of day, and then other times of day reducing that. And it's not simply the sort of the color temperature, whether the light is warm or cool, but particular wavelengths within our visual spectrum that help to do that within the body.
And so this is actually making us both physiologically and psychologically healthier if the lighting matches our natural circadian rhythms.
Yes, that's the support for that's come from research that's definitely ongoing. RPI in New York or upstate has done research that sort of developed the circadian stimulus as a way of a metric to understand how much light and when it should be dosed. And it's something that one of the researchers, Dr. Mariana Figueiredo, has been studying that in Alzheimer's patients. And so it has general implications for our health and our psychological well-being, but it has sort of shown marked improvements in patients with dementia or Alzheimer's, where we can see that this is really supporting quality of life.
And in this context, you mentioned a lovely word I've never heard before called daylight harvesting.
So daylight harvesting is, I think, it's a practice that we have in some ways because it's been sort of wrapped into a lot of the code compliance that we have in several of the US energy codes. And it's the practice of having areas of light within a space or zones of light within a space that are typically within proximity to a window or a skylight, where during the day you may not need to have the architectural lighting, the electric lighting on. And particularly in that zone, you could either dim it or turn it off, utilizing the natural daylight that's coming in. And that practice is daylight harvesting, and it is accomplished. The most simple way is just by having those lights switched separately. You turn off a switch and then turn them back on when it gets dark. But it can also be integrated into control systems that sort of do this seamlessly with sensors in the ceiling that will maintain a certain light level on the desk that might be by the window.
Mm. So how do you balance that overall need for a space where there's a number of occupants with individual requirements? I mean, how much do individuals, should they be able to adjust their own light levels, or does that get too complex within a space which other people are working in?
If a space includes several layers of light, sort of maybe there's an overall ambient layer and each individual has task lighting, that allows for a lot more localized control of an individual's environment. And I think it gives you, in very non-technical terms, but a sense of autonomy over your space, where particularly if you're coming in and you're employed by somebody else, the ability to modify to your own preferences so that you feel like you're more productive. And so I think it's something that we've seen incorporated into some of the sort of the LEED or well building standards. But in terms of best practices, I would say if there's an opportunity to have sort of more localized control, it would be a benefit to most people.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you mentioned well, obviously that's a very, lighting is a key part of the well program, which John's worked with particularly.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of compliance, as I understand it, with the US lighting code, there are no compliance requirements, there are only recommendations. And do you think there should be some more strict compliant requirements for public spaces where people are employed to work, to have access to daylight or control over their light or whatever?
There is some limited, the idea of daylight harvesting, as I mentioned, is included into a lot of energy codes now in different parts of the city. I'd say that if there were opportunities to increase access to daylight, that's great. It's not feasible in every situation. So to require it where it's just, if you're in the basement of a 40-story building, what are you going to do there? Let's take that approach and create the best electric lighting solution for that space.
Yeah, but should employees be made to work all day in their basement?
You should try to get as much light as possible. Vitamin D, a New York deficiency of vitamin D is, or New Yorkers have a known deficiency of vitamin D. But I would say that I do not think that there should be any requirement for the sort of illuminance or light levels that a space, we have recommendations for how much light needs to be in a space. I don't think that those should be requirements, because every space is particular, has its own needs, has its own users. But I would love to see sort of more ways in which the energy code can help promote some of these other ways that we can get access to natural light if possible, or increase controls, because I think controls are a big part that energy codes are starting to incorporate, but could be used further so that we can show, a space doesn't use all this energy during the day because it's always dimmed to 50%. How do we show that in our sort of documentation?
But there's also leads on to the other kind of topic that we advertise as being at the beginning of this program, being social responsibility. I'm a business employer. I have a bunch of people working in different spaces, and I'm aware of certain obligations I have towards air quality or hours of work or whatever, but there's not usually much in that relates to light, and I think there probably should be.
Yeah, one of the things that we come up upon a lot is we may be brought onto projects that have the goal of following LEED or well building practices without actually end up doing the certification.
Yeah.
And when we look at what we need to do to follow those practices, they're really just best lighting practices. and so, but they're best lighting practices because that's what we do every day. And so part of it is educating others to say, yeah, air quality is important. Your lighting quality is just as important. It has an impact on your sense of well-being. It has an impact on how tired you might feel at the end of the day. So how do we make those best practices much more standard?
Mm. And tell me about your business. How do you go about approaching social equity within your business?
Within our business, we have really tried, one primary interest that we've had since we started was to do as much public lighting as possible, or projects where there is a large opportunity for the public to access it. Buildings that are library buildings are some of my favorites. Spaces to study and sort of sit and ponder, parks and outdoor spaces. And I think, as we mentioned in a previous or an earlier conversation, the idea of public space being a really important part of our urban environments. And as we look at how to engage with cities on how they're developing public space, we've sort of inserted ourselves and said, hey, you're doing this master plan, or you're rezoning this area of the city. We'd really like you to consider lighting because there's no language about it in your plan. So part of that is us saying, hi, we would like to be a not a thorn in your side, but we would like to participate. The other sort of more general elements is that we want to be part of inclusive design teams. We want to recommend that that if there's a design project that comes up and it engages the public, or it's for the public, that the community has a say in the design process. So encouraging an owner of a building to have community meetings as part of the design process, so that the people who are going to eventually be there as residents have a say in how it's created.
I think all those public spaces are severely neglected. I mean, there's an architect here who talked about being cities are the spaces between buildings, whereas usually cities are the buildings, and spaces end up the bits that are left over between the buildings, and we put a bit of a seat and a light and a tree or whatever. Yeah. But those are the spaces people inhabit, and they're the ones that should be designed first, surely.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the things that we've also sort of championed, not just in our work, but in trying to see what we spend a lot of time looking at what the design industry locally is doing, and then in other cities. Some cities are doing it a lot better than we are, but we try to see how we can sort of be part of those conversations, to always say, this is an area that's used during the day. It's already also an area that transitions at night. And what is the nighttime character? What is the nighttime character and its relationship to light pollution? So it's not just the use for humans, but it's also the use for animals, the flora and fauna of an area. And we've done a lot of that in our work around the Gowanus Lighting Atlas that we've done as a project internally in our office. Thank you, John. This is sort of a snapshot from our a website that we put up specifically for this project, because it is ongoing, and we're proposing it as a longitudinal study of an area of the city that is going to go through rezoning, and we wanted to have a survey of the existing lighting in this area, the lighting as it goes through that development, hopefully with some of the recommendations that we've made to the city, and then what happens afterwards. How does the community get involved? And this is a night rendering of the master plan for the Gowanus Canal. And so you see the canal sort of bisecting these neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and sort of some of the proposed lighting include sort of connection points, places where we can indicate that people, as they're walking along parallel streets, will know where there are bridges and where some some of these spots you can cross over the canal, some of them are dead ends. What are the closest parks? What are the public housing campuses that we can sort of incorporate so that they don't feel apart from, they're really considered part of the neighborhood? And this also shows you a little bit of how we sort of diagram and communicate our lighting intent, which we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Great. I'm going to have to probably wind up quite soon. I've got one last question I wanted to ask you, and this is more specific to you personally, because you've done a lot of work promoting women in business and in lighting and generally. Would you like to just sort of enlarge on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I am a woman in lighting. I have had the benefit of, I went to a women's college, which also helped me sort of understand, again, the default is not women as the sort of the central focus. And so through the support of city and state programs like the Women and Minority Owned Business certification, which our studio, Sighte Studio, is part of, but also the Women in Lighting initiative that is a global initiative started by Light Collective in the UK, has ambassadors across the world. Earlier today, there was, they've done several of these sort of social roulettes where you're just communicating and starting to make connections in different places. And all of these people are there working within their own community to identify what are the key things to help promote women within the lighting industry. And so really sort of advocacy, lifting other people up, and it's not limited to women, but really taking on that perspective of social responsibility. Is I have a series of sort of like privileges and benefits and want others to have the opportunity to come in to the lighting industry, because I think it's wonderful. The design industry as a whole. The Women in Lighting Initiative also has project interviews. So you really get to learn a lot about people who are practicing at different stages of their career in different ways. So these are not, when we say lighting designers, these are lighting designers in the broad scope. There are product designers, educators, architectural lighting designers. So it's really lighting as the umbrella.
And how do you think this initiative is changing the nature of the industry? How does having more women in it change? I mean, lighting's been a very male-dominated area. What do you think you I mean, and I'd love to see it change. So how is that changed? What direction is it going? What are we seeing as a result?
So in some areas, it has been very male-dominated. In others, I see in sort of the classes of students that come into Parsons, the majority of students being women. And so what we're seeing is that there are women already practicing, but they don't always have the opportunity, depending on the community or the network, to really have a voice, or there may still be sort of staff within an office, but they aren't seeing themselves represented as the principals of firms. And I think this organization or this initiative is really helping to have that conversation, particularly in some countries where there is no other representation for them to look. This is their networking opportunity. Mm-hmm. They don't have that for lighting or for women.
If I'm walking down a street, would you think that there will be a slight change because it's being designed by women like guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think we live in a much more comfortable world, one that includes space where women aren't constantly sort of having to, the idea, if a woman could, what would a woman do if she could walk outdoors at night without men around? And the majority of women answer, I would walk outside listening to my headphones.
Yeah. Because
that's the level of sort of like always being in high alert, always being conscious of your outdoors. Just the idea that we not specifically that the world would look completely different, but that we would consider others first, and that it would be a much more sort of communal environment. That's my guess. Who knows?
Interesting comment from our friend Susanna Ruman from San Francisco Bay Area. She's one of our reps. She says she thinks it's also about engineers versus designers, and the engineers are possibly more likely to be the males, and what it's sort of like this. And
yeah, and I think we have colleagues who are doing this work who are also looking at promoting women in engineering, not just in sort of architectural engineering, but or electrical engineering, but it's at all phases trying to understand sort of what are the conversations that need to be had so that there is more parity, at the very least, more parity.
Yeah. We've got a great woman prime minister, so I'm very keen on women leading. I think we should probably wrap up the discussion.
Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
a few questions that came in. Tony Joseph, he's actually a cousin of mine from Los Angeles. He asks, question for both of us, but probably for you, Francesca, do you do both personal and commercial projects, residential and commercial?
Yeah, absolutely. I like variety. I don't like to specialize in, I specialize in lighting. That's the one thing. And the rest of it is we do a range of residential, hospitality, commercial, institutional, outdoor, the gamut of scale and type. And I love it.
Yeah, and we too, and I think what we were talking earlier, at the moment that there's been a shift. I mean, we were primarily contract commercial in America, and at the moment there's the shift towards much more residential, because that's where the work is. Yeah,
and it changes over time. It changes in terms of what's happening, and now we'll see how things continue, but it's good to have variety.
Jason, and I apologize if I get this pronunciation wrong, Odafi, JTH Lighting from Iowa, he's concerned that for him there's a challenge in balancing energy efficiency versus glare control versus visually stimulating spaces. Can you help him with that? Yes.
So glare is not our friend. There's having but there's also there's the scale of glare. There's having points of light, the play of brilliance that Richard Kelly talks about is great when you have sort of sparkle and drama. When it causes physical discomfort, it's not going to be a comfortable working environment, a comfortable residence. And it is true that a lot of lighting fixtures that sort of prioritize energy efficiency over control start to tip towards glare. Yeah. We work with manufacturers who are willing to manage those different variables, because glare control is incredibly important to our work. And I think we've still managed to find fixtures that do that. I think one of the areas where it can be a little bit more difficult is in the exterior sort of street and area lighting, where you often, you can't just put a little louver in there and cap it. But we've tried to work with manufacturers at the same time for parks or for the Department of Transportation with how they might be able to create slightly more comfortable fixtures. So not to dismiss the comment, I do think it's a real issue, but really pushing back and saying this is the quality of your lighting is going to suffer, and thus your residents are going to suffer, and trying to work with other manufacturers to help manage that. And if you can have a sort of financial metric in there, say that there's a way to sort of make it worthwhile spending the more money on the better quality, then and not necessarily thinking that it's always about it being a more expensive fixture. There's a question from Michael Cohen.
he says at the moment we're sort of in a time when we need a lot of flexibility, because we have to design right now for separation, but knowing in the future that separation will actually go away, we actually need to be coming back together again. How do we kind of create this adaptability?
So if I understand the question correctly, we have to design for social distancing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And right now, I think what we've seen is trying to create systems that are flexible in the sense of having sort of some ambient light that will give you this sort of task ambient, which is not a new concept, but having ambient light throughout the space that gives you some usable light and more localized task lighting that helps, that moves with furniture or that moves with the user, is one way that we've been able to address this now. Yeah. And that is easily reconfigurable. Yeah.
And Stuart Porteous, we think from Tasmania, high across the Tasman Sea there, Stuart. He's complaining about the lack of research and resources relating to lighting design about well-being. How can he be helped with that? Are the resources that you're aware of that lighting designers can use to help improve the well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I look a lot to see what some of the research is, trying to see what is being promoted at conferences and trade shows as under those track health and human-centric well-being. And right now, taking advantage of a lot of these conferences being online. I think that's been great. I welcome, I'm happy to share sort of, or have people reach out to me afterwards if there's anything additional, but also looking at institutions that do research and seeing what are the key topics that are being studied, because then I sort of see, oh, this is something I need to look for coming up. What is the sort of the horizon of new areas of human-centered lighting research? The conferences would be the first suggestion.
Yeah. It's just Google searching, isn't it, I guess?
Yeah.
One last question from David Yaguchi, also from Los Angeles. Hi, David. How do you feel about recessed lighting fixtures in residential design? I mean, are they still okay, or are they a big no-no?
They are, depends on the project. We do use them, and it depends on where they're needed, but we also use a variety. The lighting approach is going to vary depending on the project, and sometimes recessed lighting fixtures are sort of the cleanest way to get lighting, particularly if they're sort of adjustable or they're wall washers, being able to cleanly cover a surface. And so it doesn't mean that we want ceilings to look like Swiss cheese or like a checkerboard. There's a lot of other ways to integrate lighting, and fortunately sort of LED sources that have allowed us to integrate lighting into architecture fairly seamlessly. But yeah, it's not a yes or no answer. We definitely do use a lot when needed.
Great. Well, I think we've probably gone on longer than we were expected anyway, but it's been great, and that's a measure of how interesting it is. So thank you very much, Francesca. It's been a great talk, and it's been great to make contact, and I hope we keep in contact in the future, and I hope maybe one day quite soon we'll meet up in person, either there or here. You're welcome to come here if you.
Yes, I would really love that. I will welcome you here, but I would really love to visit you. Thank you both. John, thank you, David. It was a real pleasure to have a conversation with you.
Thanks, Francesca.
Thank you.
It's bye for now.